Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Grassroots Education Advocacy. I'm your host, Zakiya Sankara Jabbar, and I am delighted to welcome my good friend Marika Peppercorn of the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. This is going to be a really informational, I would say, presentation today and discussion. So I really hope that you all are like ready and geared up. I want to encourage you to take some notes because this is going to be something that's really important and something that you're going to want to start like paying attention to in your own local community, particularly our school districts, but really everywhere, your city level, state level. We're just going to want to be paying attention to this, and I think that today is a really probably one of the most important broadcasts I've done, quite honestly. And I couldn't think of a better person, an expert really, to come on to talk about this very important subject around algorithms and oppression and algorithms and predictive analytics. Like, listen, I am not the expert. I'm gonna let her talk. But before we get into that, I want to read my good friend's bio. So Marika Peppercorn is an interdisciplinary and cross-sector thought leader and community advocate. She's a change agent working to transform systems and scale successes across education, technology, civic leadership, and entrepreneurship. Ms. Peppercorn works along the continuum from community to theory to practice, and integrating collective cultural wisdom and applying a restorative lens to upend punitive conditions in education and to reimagine education through a liberatory lens. Most recently, her work focused on the cradle to prison algorithm, which is an emerging technology trend in educational ecosystems. Ms. Peppercorn has redefined community engagement in order to educate and raise awareness about the use of big data, predictive analytics, facial recognition, threat assessment, surveillance, and student privacy, resulting in the launch of the Data for Public Good campaign in 2019, which unfortunately is now also compounded by the now pandemic COVID-19. She has successfully co-led campaigns to end discriminatory suspension practices in Minnesota schools, to remove the presence of police in Minneapolis and St. Paul schools, respectively, and to increase investment in indigenous restorative practices in education and community settings, and is currently supporting inequality in helping education and criminal justice systems provide quality and continuous education for justice-involved young people during the COVID-19 pandemic. Her most recent project involves supporting a youth-led response to the murder of George Floyd, which has led to the founding of the Youth Initiatives for Justice Minnesota Youth Fund. Wow. Welcome, Marika. Please share anything else that does not, lie in your bio that you'd like to share with people. But I'm so excited to have you on. And again, as I said earlier, I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with today. So welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Zakiya. And I think it would be important to share that we actually met through the Dignity in Schools campaign as we were both addressing discipline disparities at the federal, regional, and local levels. So we've been in this for a minute, and I'm privileged to be seated with you across screens.
That's right. That's right. Tell us a little bit more, because, you and I have been working together for several years now, for a while. We've known each other for a minute. And I remember when I was actually, for people who don't know, I was working as a national field organizer at Dignity in Schools before heading over to Bright Beam here to lead up our activism team. And I remember you called me, right? And you were like, there's something happening here, Zakiya, and there's something called the Joint Powers Agreement, and we have got to figure out a way to push back on this. It's very harmful. It's happening very rapidly. What can you do to help? And I remember thinking immediately, oh my God, wow, that sounds like, yes, she's work. She's the leader of the Data for Black Lives group, and she was also a former member of Power U in Miami, Florida, which is a DSC member. And I immediately made that connection. And as they say, the rest is history.
You made multiple connections, but that was in 2018, I think.
Yep.
And I was just sticking my toe into this work around big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms. And as I was looking around, trying to figure out what's happening here in the landscape, I was like, Zakiya, nobody's talking about this.
Like,
What are we
help me.
supposed to do? And I was like, people are telling me I'm crazy. I need to know that this is not just something that I've made up in my head and heart that I'm fighting. I need to understand the depths of this work. And thank you so much for making those connections, because those connections stand to this day. And it wasn't just Data for Black Lives. It was actually the Hazen Foundation too, that helped us as we were organizing as a community to actually be able to lift the work up in a way that, you know, we're able to talk about it now. So you are an instrumental part of the story that I share about the work that we've been doing on the ground here. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. As you know, I'm always ready to help. I did not think you were crazy. I immediately believed you. I'm like, because listen, my knowledge of history, you know, I'm an avid reader. I'm always reading. I wasn't shocked. I'm like, oh, of course they are, right? Let's figure out like how we can push back on this. And you've done a good job of pushing back on that. I believe you actually have a PowerPoint presentation to share with us, and that, you know, we'll kind of walk through. But I know that there were several actual gatherings that you had. This was before COVID, and we met in person. And you and your organizing in the community there in St. Paul successfully, at the first, you know, iteration of this, was able to get this pushed back and stalled for a moment. Do you care to share a little bit about that before we get into your PowerPoint?
Well, I will just say that we were opposing 3 large systems, and everybody said that we couldn't do it. The train had left the station, and this was a done deal. And we said, okay, maybe the train has left the station, but that doesn't mean that the train can't slow down. And so initially, our goal was just to even be able to have them slow down enough so that we could catch up and understand what was happening. And I'm still on that journey today, and I still do not call myself an expert, because there certainly are people that are out here in this work that can pull up a definition, cite some research. But my position really has been in it is the point of entry for community needs to be clear, and we need to have a community that's equipped to participate in the design and decision making of anything that happens in general, but specifically when we're talking about emerging technology, big data, predictive analytics, and algorithms, which is like my favorite 3-word mantra, that often when I walk into a room and I say it, folks are just like, oh, who is this lady? Talking about all that stuff.
Right. It's so new, and it sounds like a foreign language almost for a lot of us. And I guess I would be remiss not to make some kind of connection to Inauguration Day. Today is Inauguration Day. We inaugurated, or this country inaugurated a new president, a 46th president. And in St. Paul, since we're talking a little bit about politics, the leaders in St. Paul all supported this joint powers agreement, and they are all of, you know, one party, I'm assuming. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I know the mayor is a Democrat, a Black Democrat. I know that most of the Twin Cities area is pretty much Democratic leaning or Democratic controlled. And I will just say, from what I've seen from Biden's priorities, his presidency seemed to be at least in line with some of these new technologies in the surveillance kind of state, unfortunately, that we're entering into. So I'm not trying to make nobody mad, and we're definitely not trying to tell anybody what to do. I do think that it's important that you know about these technologies, that you know the harms that these technologies, particularly on Black folks, right? Particularly on people of color in general, the kind of surveillance and really tracking down to the cellular level. This idea of privacy is really out the window. Am I right?
Yes. I think we are already in that space. I just think most people don't actually know that we're already here. And so the conversation that we're always having is, I'm not going to make a decision for you whether this is good or bad, but my role, or what my purpose is really to make sure that people have all the information to make the appropriate decisions for themselves, their families, and their community. And the one thing I will say is that you will hear in the Biden administration and most administrations, government organizations, the language that they're using right now is efficiency and effectiveness. And that is actually
They're
code
using innovation too to make it sound
and
good, right?
innovation, yes, like a silver bullet. Efficiency and effectiveness is code for machine learning, mechanized processes. It's going to be someone other than a human that is driving decision making, because as humans, it's deemed that we are not as efficient and as effective as we could be. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is kind of unpack where efficiency and effectiveness actually shows up in the language and how we encountered it in the JPA story here in the Twin Cities. So I'm going to
Let's do it.
let's do it. Play from current slide. Oh, that's not the right place to do it though. Just bear with me. Okay,
yeah,
play
you're
from,
fine. Just present mode. Yeah.
All right, so what I am going to share is a story about the Joint Powers Agreement that happened in the Twin Cities. And although the majority of the story that I'll tell you will talk about how the community organized from 2018 on, I need you to know that the story has origins much further back, and that the point of entry for St. Paul is in 2014. But first, I just wanted to share with you that what we saw and what happened in the Twin Cities is that we had a data sharing agreement, a cross-system data sharing agreement between multiple jurisdictions. And these jurisdictions are really critical to think about who is involved in this process and who actually will have access to information by sharing across the system. So this data sharing agreement was between St. Paul Public Schools, the city of St. Paul, and Ramsey County. And so when you think of each of these institutions, like St. Paul Police is a part of the city of St. Paul. Housing is a part of their budget program in St. Paul. And specifically, when you think about Ramsey County, it's, I think, the third largest funding mechanism in the state for the county systems for really funding public health and human services. So in Ramsey County, you have probation, you have the county prosecutor's office, you have health and human services, public health, child protection. And all of these organizations hold very critical information, very critical data about the people that receive these services from the county. And then in the St. Paul Public Schools, you have free and reduced information, you have attendance, you have all these different kinds of pieces that put into a bigger picture, gives access to people to have information that they haven't had in the past. So this large-scale cross-system data sharing agreement was born.
Without people's permission, right? Like people are not given permission, right?
Right, and I will get to the background of the story, but what I wanted to say is that, as you mentioned, we had all of the boards. Ramsey County Board has about 12 people. The St. Paul School Board has about 7 people. The City of St. Paul has, I think, a large council, but this agreement was approved unanimously. And not only did they try to share expansive data, they also tried to include the integration of predictive analytics and to use algorithms. And I'll speak more to what those terms meant, because at that stage in the story, when we were finding out and surfacing all that, we didn't have a clear sense of what that was. But what they told us is that this data sharing agreement that would share information across systems was intended to improve, there's the service effectiveness, and increase efficiencies by using artificial intelligence, a machine, to identify children suspected of being at risk of future criminal behavior. And what they called it was upstream services. Oh, we're going to get ahead of this. There's the potential that these students will be exposed or be a part of systems that are criminal. And if we identify them, flag them earlier enough, we'll be able to prevent them from being future criminals. So this is their thinking, that if we collect all this information and that we apply a risk score, assign a number to determine how much risk a student or a family is of participating in criminal behavior, we'll be able to prevent future crime.
So
Sounds like a movie almost.
it sounds
Yeah.
like a movie. And let me, I have to say this, as a parent, as you all, the people who do know me, know that I got into this work because of my own child. And a lot of us are in this work because of the children in our lives that we love. And we know that disproportionality, it's already an issue. We know that racism, anti-Blackness is already embedded in the current systems, right, that we have. And so it was troubling when I learned about this, that they're actually going to use this data that we already know is packed with bias, to create a risk score for who will be a future criminal. We're already, so now this innovation will criminalize babies, literally. And the fact that they're using data from public health, they're using data from, county services in most states, child protection.
Yeah.
So if your mother or if your family gets public benefits or gets, any kind of public benefits, that's going to be included in a risk score. And so who do you think that's going to impact the most, right? And so that's, I'm trying to make this real for people, beyond words on a screen. So
and I will get more in depth. So what I'm going to share with you as a timeline, because as we think about decisions that are made in schools, institutions for communities, oftentimes when decisions like in 2018, when they were approving this agreement, isn't where it began. This vision was born in the county prosecutor's office in Ramsey County. So the first challenge that we had is anything born in the county prosecutor's office is affiliated and associated with mass incarceration in the state of Minnesota and elsewhere, right?
Right.
And so this idea was born in the county prosecutor's office. So they went to local philanthropy and they said, we have an idea and we need you to fund a community engagement process. And so there's this community engagement grant that they received for $200,000 where they paid community members to host engagement sessions to ask community members, what is it that if we were going to work upstream and put things in place that would support young people, what would those things look like? So they got this grant. They brought together folks in Ramsey County. They brought together communities of color. They brought together the indigenous community. They separately met with each of these indigenous groups and other BIPOC groups to say, what are your thoughts about this? So that's one community engagement effort that they had. And then they also had a task force that was convened by the county prosecutor's office. And it was called the Task Force on Safe Schools, because at that time we'd been having some clashes between students and teachers. And so they were talking about how can we make our schools more safe. And so in these community sessions, what you heard from community members is they would like indigenous restorative practice that would be applied across the board. They would like more staff of color. They would like to invest in counselors. They would like to remove police from the schools. And so they had come up with this large list of recommendations through this engagement process. And what happened is that community engagement feedback was boiled down to one concept that never actually happened in the conversation between community and institutions. So communities members were saying, it's important to share data within your institution or system to be informed. Well, that simple statement was translated to say, we believe that data should be shared across systems, which was never brought up in any of these community engagement sessions. And I also have to say that community members that participated in these engagement sessions said, we feel really hesitant to participate in this because our information and our input in the past has been used and it was not used in a way that we approved of. And so we are trepidatious. We don't trust that what you collect from us here will lead to an end that actually serves and responds to what the community is asking for. So all of a sudden, the community engagement is done, and the community goes away. They're over here. They don't know what
It
happened
wasn't
to
real
all of it.
community engagement. Let's just be real about that. Yeah.
No, I would not say that. The community came up with real recommendations and suggestions. The problem is none of those suggestions and recommendations saw the light of day.
I guess what I mean by they weren't truthful insofar as everything that was really happening. That's what I mean. Yeah.
No, they were not
That's not
transparent
consent.
about what their intent was. That's not
Exactly.
consent. They were not
Right.
transparent about their intent, and they
Right.
were not transparent about the report. Literally, we reviewed the report that came out from those parents and community members providing feedback, and we compared it against the report that was used to compel our elected officials to unanimously approve this agreement. Because they said, look, the community's on board. They want cross-system data sharing. And that was the bottom of the conversation. At that point, predictive analytics wasn't even on the table for the elected officials or for the community members. So then you involved folks. They're like, how are we going to afford to do something as massive as this? St. Paul and Ramsey County have legacy technology, which means it's really old. So how would you even be able to collect, hold, protect, and dispose of all of this information in a reasonable manner? They had also proposed that you needed to create an entirely new governing structure made out of those three bodies that would oversee this data, and that community would be structurally excluded from that governing body to oversee the data. And they had recommended that the chief of police, a representative from the county prosecutor's office, and a member of the school board would be on that governing body. And so another red flag was, why would the chief of police need to be on a governing body that has that much access to information? And so that was one of our concerns as well. And the other one was that they were proposing that third sector capital, which is social impact funding, would do a feasibility study. And what they came up with and said is,
what's social impact funding? I'm sorry. What's that? What is social impact funding?
I'm about to share that with you because I didn't know either.
I'm like, what is it?
They said, we believe that in addition to collecting all this data, if you apply predictive analytics and use an early warning risk system, that you can really get in front of young people turning into criminals. And as a matter of fact, we believe this to be so true that we will give you a loan up front. And if you are as an effective and efficient in reducing the number of students that enter the juvenile justice system, we'll give you a break on your loan. And you may not actually have to pay us back, because this is a new way of funding nonprofit, education, government sectors, is this effectiveness and efficiency model to say we were able to mitigate or to stop this to this level or degree. And using this as an opportunity to demonstrate that. So this is where the National Council of Crime and Delinquency comes in, because they are a national organization that delivers predictive analytics. So what they would do for Ramsey County and St. Paul is design an algorithm. They would use predictive analytics to create an algorithm that would communicate who was most at risk for entering the juvenile justice system. And so they've done this in juvenile justice. It has not been seen as much in education. So what you also see is a crossing over of patterns and practices from criminal and juvenile justice into the education system. So now you have the incentive, because there's money that will fund this what we call the silver bullet. And there's an institution, the National Council of Crime and Delinquency, that will partner with us, and they won't charge us for the first couple of years as they're designing this algorithm, because this is going to be used to demonstrate to other educational institutions that this is a useful tool and worth the investment. So all of these things are happening outside of conversation with community. Actually, elected officials aren't even in the conversation. This really is the staff of Ramsey County Prosecutor's Office, the mayor's office, and then St. Paul Public Schools leadership, the superintendent and their chief of staff. So these are folks that are working with their internal people, their legal people, to say, can we do this? How will we do this? How much will it cost? And at this time, we became aware that this was going to be moving forward because it showed up in a consent agenda, and not because they communicated to the community, this is a result of community engagement, we're going to go in this direction. So all of a sudden, we see the actual joint powers agreement that they are proposing to move forward in advance. And so again, here you see, this is the first time that we saw language beyond collecting data that they were going to be using predictive data analytics. And you see John Choi is the county prosecutor, and he's an elected. So he proposed reducing juvenile justice system involvement by being able to flag students for being at risk. And then using the collaborations, the data from the other districts to be able to identify those students. And so from those predictive analytics, they were going to create an alert system to target appropriate interventions. I want you to put a pin in there for target appropriate interventions. We will come back to that. But what I want to highlight is what we also saw in this data sharing agreement, cross-system data sharing agreement, is that non-district parties may receive, under appropriate circumstances, information from the districts that would not otherwise be available to them in order to better serve youth and families. So what does that mean? That means the police department is going to get information about child protection services, foster care, health and human services. They could get the information on the background of families in St. Paul Public Schools. And so we're like, oh no, this is completely unacceptable. So we coordinated and we launched the Coalition to Stop the Cradle to Prison algorithm. And so what we see here is that when they put together this data sharing agreement, they did not put any prohibition on what data was collected. It was going to collect all data. They did not put prohibition on how long they would be collecting data. And so that was really problematic. And then who would have access to data? And so we had all these questions. And we found that they were very resistant. When I say they, the elected officials, the policymakers, and the decision drivers in those systems were really reluctant to meet with us. They tried to write us off as crazy community members that didn't understand what innovation was and that we were just opposed to anything new. So we said, okay, you can say all these things about us, but you're not able to answer these questions. And so what we had to do was take a step back and do some education and engagement on our own. We needed to understand what these terms meant and how they could potentially impact our community. And so we did a lot of sessions about understanding what the language is. We did a data lab. We did algorithmic improv. Zakiya, you were at one of the first sessions that we held. We held a summit to really just engage with parents, because most people were not even aware that this happened, and that even folks that have participated in those earlier years in the community engagement, they did not know this was how it was showing up 4 years later in decisions by these institutions. So they're going to be using predictive analytics. Nobody talked about it. They're going to be using an early alert system to identify students that could potentially be at risk. And they were going to be sharing that information with people under appropriate circumstances, and who gets to determine that. So we had some concerns. One, when they were proposing to use predictive analytics, what they said was, we're going to use data around out-of-school suspensions. We could potentially use data around attendance. We proposed using data to see if a student's family member, parent, sibling, or other had been involved in the juvenile justice system. And by looking at all these indicators, we would be able to assign a risk score of 1 to 5, saying this student is more likely to be involved in criminal behavior and end up in the criminal justice system. And so Zakiya, this is where I actually like come into the story, and I'm like, wait a second. So we in Dignity in Schools and our local organizing have been pushing for school districts to collect data around out of school suspensions because they were saying it wasn't happening disproportionately to Black
now they go turn around and use it against us.
Really hard to get that data. And now they're going to say, we're going to use these suspension data to inform whether you're more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. And I guess that would be fair if the same year that they announced that, 43 school districts in the state of Minnesota had not been identified for discriminating against Black and brown students in out-of-school suspensions. So the fact that they could even suggest using out-of-school suspension, it baffled our minds. Like, we couldn't even believe that would be a suggestion, because to us, like, this is common knowledge that we are struggling with an education system that keeps putting Black students out. And then we looked a little deeper and we said, okay, well, they could be using free and reduced lunch. So that targets a population that doesn't touch anyone else. They could be using attendance. And then we started noticing all of these indicators that they were going to use to identify our students as future criminals were deficit-based and attached to bias. Because what might be a reason for a lack of attendance? Their rationale is like, it's the fault of the family, it's the fault of the student. Whereas there is no ownership of, maybe the teachers really suck and the student doesn't want to be there because they are experiencing kind of discrimination. Like, we don't even know what the data about the attendance tells us because it doesn't collect that detailed of information. And so again, you're looking through a very biased lens to tell us whether a student is we're able to predict if a student's going to be involved in juvenile justice. And so this is the story we said, does this make you feel okay as a parent or student? Like, thinking that they could make a decision about you based on that information. And after one of the sessions, we held a session with young people to talk about what this could mean to them in St. Paul's public schools. And the conversation, we shared the information like we are right now. And everyone was really quiet. We're like, okay, maybe we didn't make the words accessible. Maybe the session was too long. Maybe we offered too much information. Like, that's often the response and impact we get, is this overwhelming feeling after we do a presentation. But one of the students called me back, I think a couple days later, and she said she was sitting in her high school classroom of about 30 students, and she was looking around and saying, okay, if I was using predictive analytics and I was going to assign risk to each of these students, she looked around and said, I'd probably give them a 5. I know they're trouble. And she looked around and kept giving numbers, like the people in the front of the class usually got the lower numbers. And then she paused because she said, well, if you use the data from last year, we had housing instability. My mom lost her job and we were bouncing around from place to place. And she said, I might have been flagged as a 5 if they just looked at me at that one point of time. And their system would have flagged me as a future criminal. And she's like, predictive analytics or an algorithm does not have the right to predict my future because that information is wrong. And so that same question kept on saying, community members kept popping up and saying, how are they able to do this? Like, our American Indian community was like, we have sovereignty over our bodies, our information, and our data, and we have an agreement with the St. Paul Public Schools. How is it even possible that these conversations took place without our formal Indian education department even being aware of it? We have an agreement. We have a consent decree.
Well, unfortunately, we know the United States history and their agreements with Native Americans.
Right, but they started talking about data sovereignty. So we had all of this pushback. And as a community, we kept having meetings. We prepared people to go out and talk to officials to just question them and say, this is not what we intended. And what we came up with was a policy brief that we pulled together with the reasons why we believe a system like this was not actually intended to support and serve students. So the first thing I will say is they were willing to spend all this money on getting the technology in place and partnering with these outside institutions. And they were never able to tell us what the budget for it was going to be. They couldn't explain to us why it was such a deficit-based model. And we really felt like what they were proposing was basically racially profiling children as future criminals through using a predictive analytic tool that draws from inaccurate data that actually reflects the biases the systems our youth and our families are in, than actually looking at the strengths or the challenges of the students. It also, really the way that they were framing it is stigmatizing, labeling families by assigning a risk score to flag them for services. And that information, we already know, like with the labeling, and this, although we say this is a confidential process, our community did not trust that this would be confidential. That they would be using money that would be going to support human beings, counselors, community members, social workers, working directly, out of school time programs, restorative practitioners, being in the spaces, that money would now be diverted to a more efficient and effective system, which would be about the study and surveillance rather than the services themselves. Because what I will say is, we said, okay, let's say we went along with you. Let's say a student was identified with a high risk score. What does all of this technology do about that? What do they actually change if the student has been flagged? And the answer they gave to us was no answer. They said, well, what we would do is we would let the case manager know, or a social worker know, that the student had been flagged, and the social worker would go out to their house and say, hey, look, you've been flagged for the potential to be involved in the juvenile justice system, and we want to help you not do that. So here's like a list of some resources. So our question is, what is the difference? We already know the challenges that our families and our youth and our students are already experiencing. We already know who they are. So why do we need a computer system and spending all that money on a computer system to get to the same end, where you're still not providing the solutions that address the root causes of what is happening in our education systems? And it ignores addressing the actual system injustice, the bias and the harm that is there. So they're ignoring system responsibilities for correcting the disparities by masking those decisions with computer analysis, rather than the human relationship of somebody who may make an error, but there's still another human that can challenge that error. Our concern is that once you go to this technological system, is that you can't really push back on a system. You can push back on a person, but people often defer to technology over humanity and giving it a greater precedent or a place than us as people saying, no, that's not what's going to work for our community. And so, like we mentioned in that earlier community engagement, they had listed all of these services they would like to see supported. Why didn't they just do that at the front end, rather than getting the $200,000 from the Bush grant for identifying $300,000 to do evaluation on an annual basis? So basically, we kept on organizing and pushing back, reaching out to national people like you, Zakiya, and the Data for Black Lives, because they kept calling us crazy. And eventually, what happened was that there was a data breach, and that the information in our legacy technology system of Ramsey County was hacked. And so it demonstrated that they did not even have the ability to protect the information that currently exists within the system. And so finally they said,
I have a question really quickly. Just interject really quickly. Were there any legal advocates to come forward? As you know, the First Amendment and all of that is something that's really important, to a lot of people in this country. Did you all get any support from legal advocacy organizations who normally litigate around things like that and privacy?
So Yes. The local ACLU did send a FOIA request to Ramsey County, the city of St. Paul, and St. Paul Public Schools, which they did not respond to at all. And so they were at tables with us. We consulted with legal people saying, like, what is state law about data collection and privacy? What is our state law? What is the federal law? And so folks were like, yeah, I don't think they actually did their due diligence with this. I think they just got excited by a shiny new silver bullet. And so we kept on building evidence that could challenge the validity of doing this. And so eventually, after that data breach, by the way, that was August 8th, 2018, that data breach happened. 1 year later, they found out how much deeper that data breach had actually come. So they had to send out, they're required to share information about data breaches that impact over 500 people. Well, a year later, they found out that data breach went back 17 years. And they do not know all of the people that were impacted by it. And the reason I know that is one of the people in our coalition got a notification that her data was breached because she received Medicaid or Medicare as a young person when she was in school. So they had her data from way back then. And so as we were thinking about, they have no prohibition on what data they collect. They've named the indicators, but they planned on collecting everything and didn't say we're going to go in and only collect for these reasons. So we knew that, we didn't know, we knew that, like, wow, why would you need to collect absolutely everything? That seems like a lot of data. And how are you actually going to protect it? So these questions kept on coming up with system challenges where they weren't actually able to handle what they had proposed. And so they said, okay, why don't we get rid of the predictive analytics and we'll just do the data collection. We're like, no, you have further harmed the trust with our community. You don't seem to get the idea that this is not a good idea, yet you're still just saying the process was wrong, not the end product. And so eventually they finally dissolved the agreement. We were successful in getting them to dissolve it, but we wanted them to understand that this was so much bigger than this moment. So we did a restorative process with them where we met with them at least 4 times, and we talked about how is it that you could completely look over the historic harm that you all have perpetuated on data collection with our communities. And they're like, well, we never did that. We're like, you're a representative of your system, so you have to own that when you go into it. And we went through a restorative process, and they, quote unquote, seemed to learn. I believe that they just were embarrassed and had to shut it down because too many bad media releases were coming out at the time. So it was the effect of our organizing as a campaign,
Powerful
the media coming in, national pressure. Yes. But what I will say, as a result, and since then, they have made another power play. Because, after that, we had folks coming and saying, well, we want you to review this proposal. We'd hate to see what happened before. We hate to waste that much money 3 years in and then have to have it crashed by community. So what they proposed is changing state law so that it would not require a joint powers agreement to be able to collect and share cross-system data. So the battle continues. But as we're doing that, we didn't stop organizing. So we are still equipping community members around the state now. We actually launched this last week. We have a 6-month fellowship called the No Data About Us Without Us Fellowship. And so we are training youth and parents across the state of Minnesota to be able to have conversation about what data is, what predictive analytics is. We're going to have a day at the Capitol so they start talking to the state legislature so they understand that there is an organized community around the laws that you are trying to change here and that you're not going to do it without our voice as a part of the process. And so one of the biggest things now is that these institutions are like, well, we need a legitimate body of community members that are going to approve this. And so now they're going around looking for people that will say, okay, we've involved community, they were part of the decision making, and we're still going to go ahead with this. And so that's where the tension lies now, is we need to have that tipping point of not just education, parents, and youth, but Like, this is not just happening in education. This is happening across the board in human services, in other ways. A big umbrella that we talk about this emerging technology is smart cities. It's the Internet of
Yeah,
Things. They're trying to
Internet of
connect all
Things.
these boxes and be able to collect what we call metadata, all these pieces of information about young people so they can inform their decisions and also inform policies and practices without actually, again, having that voice that had they engage with us authentically from the beginning, we might actually have outcomes where we're fully funding indigenous restorative practices in St. Paul Public Schools. But no, we don't.
I think that that's amazing. I don't know if you had more to share. I don't see the PowerPoint anymore, but I wanted to see if you would take an opportunity to define some of these.
Yeah.
You threw out a lot in that last couple sentences. So, what is the Internet of Things? If we can define that for our audience, what is predictive analytics at the very basic level? What the heck is an algorithm? Right? Like, if we could do
Yeah.
some basic defining for our audience so that they can like understand and try to connect. I'll say as an example, and I remember when my husband told me this a couple of years ago, and it didn't connect until I started like working with you on this issue. But like our cell phones, if you have a smartphone, it's a tracker. Like literally all of your data is in that, right? And like you're being tracked by Google, these big data, or when you hear about big tech companies, that's what people are talking about, right?
Yes. And so my partner at the Twin Cities Innovation always says privacy is no longer an assumption of the Constitution because
It
we
doesn't
have
exist.
emerged.
Yeah.
It exists, but like the laws, the federal laws of the land have not kept pace to protect. So FERPA, a lot of these other laws that school districts are saying, FERPA protects you. It's not. You have to look at the local and state level policies to really ensure that something is in place. Minnesota does not have enough in place. And I just have to do a shout out to Kulia Pringle, who is showing up in the feeder because she was one of those community members who showed up and was knocking the city council school board door. Like, you can't ignore me. I don't care if you don't like me. This is about our families and our children. So she was a critical member of the Coalition to Stop the Cradle to Prison algorithm. So to get back to, yes, the struggle continues. So to get back to these definitions, let's start with algorithm. So an algorithm is a recipe. And in a recipe, you need to know what you're trying to cook, right? So in a recipe, you need to know what it's going to look like on the end. What does success look like? And so they were trying to create a recipe for who would be involved in the juvenile justice system. So you have to have historical data. So the data they were collecting was discipline, out of school suspensions, attendance. So those are all actually the recipes. And so you all plug them into this algorithm machine, and the recipe is going to say, if this happens, then this. I know this is not easy to necessarily understand, but basically it's a recipe for success. Kathy O'Neill, who is a woman that wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction, describes it as an algorithm of success would be, she wants to create a healthy meal for her family that's easy to prepare and meets the health guidelines of whatever. And so she needs to prepare the food, make sure that she's got all the ingredients covered, that it's delivered at a certain time. So her definition of success is her children are eating healthy. Now, if you ask the children what their definition of success is, it is not that they're eating healthy food. The definition of success is that they like the food. And so whoever is designing an algorithm gets to put in the end output of what does success look like. So success in what they were proposing in St. Paul was success is that you never would have been suspended. So That's impossible for Black and brown students in St. Paul, because it was proven that they were being discriminated against. Success would mean you always have good attendance. Well, that doesn't take into consideration the dynamics of our families and how they show up and support each other. Maybe they're helping out with a sibling. Maybe there was a conflict at the school and they're avoiding getting in a fight because no adults are stepping up to protect them. Maybe a teacher had shamed them in the class and they didn't feel comfortable in that space anymore. So you have all these different ingredients that are going to tell you one thing if you believe that this information is accurate. I'm sorry. I will send you to Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Kathy O'Neill, Virginia Eubanks. They all have really, really good definitions of what an algorithm and predictive analytics are. But predictive analytics is looking at as much data as you can and using a metric.
A mathematical formula. Yeah.
Yes. And then the Internet of Things is still a nebulous idea to me, but it's how our technology speaks and interacts with all the things around us. Do you have like one of those like echo dot things, or what are they called? Like, hey Siri, da 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 da.
And all that, yeah.
Yeah, so they can talk to your different applications, whether you have it structured in your car. And the Internet of Things, I mentioned the smart cities. So the Internet of Things might be, it would tell you where there's an open parking spot. And at the same time it's telling you where there's an open parking spot, they know where you are and how long you're there. So this information collects and surveilled at the same time. And again, I am the person that will say, this is really important for you to learn. Here's some tools to help you learn, but I am not an expert. I am on a continuum of understanding the implications and what this all means to us.
Me too. And I'll drop in, since you're dropping names for people to go and study and read about. People may also want to, you know, how do I say this? And because I think it's important to say, but please study nanotechnology. Also study biotechnology and this idea of what we're talking about, the Internet of Things and algorithms and surveillance, and knowing that the nanotechnology and the biotechnology actually will surveil you down to your own biology, right? Literally, like, I mean, coding, like your DNA is going to be a part of some kind of predictive and surveillance, and people should be aware of that. I know it sounded like conspiratorial now, but it's true.
And I have been called a conspiracy theorist. I'm like, who, me? Are you kidding? I'm pretty mainstream. I'm not your radical. But what I will say, I don't know if your audience has read Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow.
Yeah, well, it's all connected.
Yes, Dr. Ruha Benjamin at Princeton and the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. She wrote Race After Technology, but the longer name is Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, because they're coding inequity into how we operate as a country. So if there is a book that has really informed me in this process,
I see all the notes you have in the book.
Oh my goodness, I tell you what, it is eye-opening and accessible.
It's eye-opening and accessible. And so, you know, when people say things like conspiracy, it just means that they don't know, or they're not reading, or they're not like making the connections, you know, to certain things.
Yes.
And
like, who, me?
Yeah. And this program is all about like trying to build power among the people who will be susceptible to this. And we know that the same communities who are currently on the margins are also going to be surveilled and controlled down to this level. And so this is something that, like you said, people think it's a done deal, but I want to say that it's really not. And we do have the power to push back on some of this to the best of our ability, as we have done historically anytime there's been a quote unquote new innovation. Marika, I really want to appreciate you. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, sharing about the amazing work that you all are doing in the Twin Cities. I know that you have also connected with folks in other communities who are now like, oh, wait a minute, this happened in my community.
Yeah. We
And do you want
actually,
to, yeah,
yeah,
please share.
we actually did a research project this summer, a co-community research project that looked at 25 cities across the country, and we had community members and go look at their Department of Education or their school district website to see how the district communicated about the use of their data. And what I will say is St. Paul, Minnesota is not alone. A lot of the school districts are having conversations. They may be calling it, rather than cross data system sharing, they're calling it interoperability. And so that is a term you're going to need to pay attention to. But of the 25 school districts that we did a search, and we had a metric about how well they communicated around the data, our folks aren't our institutions are not doing a good job of communicating, and that is why it's here. But right now we need to be putting political pressure on policies that will actually protect us, because right now they've got the tech lobbyists and everyone else saying this is the answer to everything, without any protections in place. And you'll see the further criminalization of education, of whether it's threat assessments, predictive analytics, Gaggle, which is a Gmail surveillance, or you have the social media monitoring. We are moving
Silicon
into even
Valley
more
has
hyper surveillance. And so, like in Minnesota, and I know your show is ending, I apologize, but in Minnesota, we got rid of our school resource officers in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they're replacing them with hyper surveillance and still law enforcement people. So it's just like this challenge is accelerating. And COVID has accelerated it as well. And so it's opened doors that wouldn't have been open before. The CARES Act provided resources for people to pay for this new technology and replace legacy technology. So the time is now to get involved and engaged.
That's right. The time is now. How can people find you? How can people follow your work and learn more if they'd like to?
Well, send us an email at info@tciamn.org. You can also visit our website, www.tciamn.org. And hopefully I'll get to come back on this show with you, Zakiya, because we all just scratched the surface.
I already know you definitely got to come back, because we, especially, as we're moving forward, as you mentioned, COVID-19 has exacerbated this. Especially, we didn't even get a chance to talk about the kind of data collection they're doing during virtual learning, right? Can you imagine the data that's being collected on our kids in this virtual learning environment? It's amazing.
It's all consuming. And that is a show in itself.
That's a show in itself. In fact, that's what we should focus on. Maybe the next time, if you want to put a PowerPoint together and get this out to folks.
Because they're actually marrying social emotional learning with this technology now. And so, we want to make sure that we're taking care of the interests of our students and their emotional wealth. So let us surveil them.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope we didn't depress people too much with this broadcast, but my aim is always to equip people with knowledge and information that they can pick up the mantle and work in their own backyards, right? That's what this is about, right? I don't want people to say, well, I didn't know and I didn't know. We want you to know, right? That's what this program is about. We want you to build power in your own backyard, to be able to push back on these systems of surveillance, especially for Indigenous people as in Minnesota, and Black folks and other people of color. Thank you, Marika. You'll definitely be back, and we'll look at virtual learning in the context of this all-consuming data collection. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. Take care. Have a good day, everyone. We'll